Good morning. These are the class lecture notes for Tuesday, March 10th, 2015. Starting off with the Sibley Commission today. Georgia obviously was very reluctant to participate in voluntary desegregation in the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. 1955, as a protest, the Georgia General Assembly voted to cut funds to any system that did desegregate in Georgia. In other words, any school system that did go ahead and move to put the black and white students together, that the state was going to actually cut off their funding for the school system. In 1960, under increased pressure from the federal government, the state formed the Sibley Commission. The Sibley Commission simply was a government agency that was formed to study the issue of desegregation, to see how the citizens of Georgia really felt about it. After many surveys and after they traveled the state, they gave their findings to the Georgia General Assembly, and in 1960 they came up with the conclusions that Georgians said they would rather close the schools than desegregate. The commission decided to let the individual systems decide whether or not to abide by the federal rulings or to close the schools, and many private schools opened in the state of Georgia in response to the issue. In other words, a lot of people who did not want their children attending public desegregated schools chose to actually open private schools. Some of these were just in private homes. Some of these would have been less than 20 children. It was almost, in a lot of cases, homeschooling, but this was in reaction to the upcoming desegregation of the Georgia schools. Moving on to Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter Galt. Even though a lot of the public school systems had already been integrated, if you'll recall, the Little Rock Nine actually integrated the Little Rock, Arkansas public school system in the fall of 1957. In 1961, the University of Georgia was still not integrated. It was still an all-white institution. UGA, also feeling the pressure from the federal government, just knew that they needed to bring African American students into their student body, and in 1961 they admitted Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter Galt, who had already been attending college elsewhere, but they approached them to become the first two students at the University of Georgia at Athens. As a matter of fact, these two had applied, and the institution thought these would be two good ideal people to start. Governor Ernest Vandiver was criticized for allowing this. He had been elected on a pledge to fight integration. Later, he said he had been wrong to run on that position, and he pushed for further smooth integration. Hunter Galt became a nationally known reporter. She has worked for CNN. She has worked overseas. Hamilton Holmes became an orthopedic surgeon. Both of these people very, very successful in their own right after leaving UGA and furthering their careers. So they underwent a lot of the same treatment that you saw in a lot of other part of countries. There were protests on the campus. There were burnings on the campus. These two had to endure being spit on and being taunted. It was a very difficult situation for both, but again, as you can see, they both came through very successful on the other side. The Albany movement. Albany is a southwestern Georgia town. It's kind of between Macon and the southwestern, border of Alabama, the Apalachicola River area. Their schools were still segregated in 1961, as a majority of Georgia schools still were. There were few African Americans who were registered to vote in Albany, despite being almost half of the population, 40% of the population. It was a situation where they, as you've seen in some of the Selma footage we've shown, they were intimidated to not go to the polls. They were still using poll taxes and literacy tests and such like that, and mainly just intimidation to keep them out. It was a small town, and if people saw that somebody they knew was going to vote, the word could get around, and it could be a potential situation where somebody might lose a job, get thrown off of a sharecropping situation or such like that. What the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, decided to do was they went after the bus station. In the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, federal bus lines were desegregated. In other words, any buses that were traveling from state to state, they were required to not only integrate, but to let African American riders sit wherever they wanted to on the bus. However, the individual cities, such as Albany being a good example, their waiting rooms were still segregated into whites only and coloreds only waiting rooms. So they organized the movement to protest these segregated waiting rooms and to hopefully get that fixed. Now, unfortunately, the police chief in Albany, his name was Laurie Pritchett, they actually for better or for worse, they came up with a better plan to thwart the protesters than a lot of other southern cities did. What they did was they had several of the surrounding towns clear out their jails, so they had lots of room to potentially put protesters in jail. So when the protests started, they actually locked up all of the protesters. One of the protesters that was released first was Dr. King, because they knew that Dr. King would get the most publicity by being in jail. So by releasing him and keeping everybody locked up, Dr. King didn't have anybody else to protest with him in Albany at this time. This particular movement was before the later marches in Birmingham, where they actually did recruit school children to come out and protest, while a lot of the adults that would have been available to protest were still actually locked up in prison. So this was actually a setback because they did not get a lot of publicity at the time. Dr. King was very frustrated at trying to get the movement. They'd kind of gotten outsmarted on this one. This started a little bit of a setback for the civil rights movement. From about 1961 to 1963, the civil rights movement actually took a little bit of a step back as far as what they were able to accomplish. However, the actions that they took there did eventually force changes in Albany's government. It did bring enough pressure, it brought enough attention to what was going on in Albany to where they actually did have to go and eventually, move towards more integrated policies and such like that. All right, the last one we're going to take a look at today is the March on Washington in 1963. I think that's the last one. Let's see. We're going to do 4 today. So the last topic that we're going to cover today is going to be the March on Washington in 1963. President Kennedy, in response to a lot of the actions that had been going on, especially in Alabama with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and a lot of the footage of the student protesters being basically hurtled down the street by fire department fire hoses and such, he sent strong civil rights legislation to Congress in June of 1963, and Congress dragged its feet on passing the bill. A lot of Southern congressmen, but there were also a lot of Congress people up north that were not for this legislation. This was something that was going to anger a lot of their constituencies or the people that voted for them, and it's something that they really did not want to be involved with. Becoming very frustrated, Dr. King and others organized a march in August of 1963, where over 250,000 people attended a rally in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where, of course, the highlight of the day was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. There were other performances. John Lewis was one of the featured speakers. As a matter of fact, Georgia Congressman John Lewis was the youngest speaker that spoke in the March on Washington that day. It brought a lot of attention. It got a lot of widespread press. It had a lot of people talking about it. Unfortunately, it still really didn't do a lot to get the legislation passed through Washington at that time. It was still another year and the assassination of President Kennedy before the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 would ever be passed. But this is still considered one of the high water marks, whereas since the Albany movement from about 1961 to 1963, the Civil Rights movement had been a little bit stalled between the March on Washington, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. 1963 was basically a year where the Civil Rights movement kind of got back on track after about 2 years of backpedaling a little bit and started to come back in the forefront and began to make people think about their plight and what the African Americans in the United States were actually working for at this time. If you have any questions about anything I've talked to today, feel free to tweet me or to shoot me an email at joel.cantrell@halco.org. And that is the end of today's notes. Thank you.